God will make a way in 2025. As we stand on the threshold of a new year, a new chapter, let us take a moment to reflect on this profound truth: God will make a way. In the world we live in, uncertainty often feels like the air we breathe. Questions loom heavy, circumstances feel immovable, and challenges rise like mountains before us. But I stand here to tell you with every fiber of conviction that the God we serve is not confined by what we see. He is a waymaker. When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea, it seemed like the end. An army behind them, water ahead of them, and no human solution in sight. But our God is not limited by the barriers of this world. What seemed impassable to man was simply an opportunity for God to demonstrate his power. The sea parted and a way was made. That same God is at work today, and he will make a way for you in 2025. But here's the challenge: trusting the path you cannot yet see. Faith is not just a feeling, it is an act of courage. It is standing firm when the ground feels shaky and walking forward even when the path is hidden. In Hebrews 11:1, we are reminded that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That you may not see the door yet, but God has already prepared it. Your role is to trust and walk in faith. Let me tell you something about God's provision. It doesn't always come in the form we expect. When the Israelites cried out for food, God didn't give them a feast as they envisioned. He gave them manna, something they had never seen or tasted before. That's the nature of our God. He will provide what you need, even if it comes in a form you don't recognize. So in 2025, open your heart to unexpected blessings. And what about those seasons when it feels like nothing is happening? The waiting periods, the silent seasons when your prayers seem to echo back unanswered? Let me remind you, delays are not denials. That God is not ignoring you. He is preparing you. He is preparing you. A farmer does not plant seeds and expect to harvest the next day. The soil must be tilled, the rain must come, and the roots must grow deep. In the same way, God's timing is perfect, even when we don't understand it. Remember this: every great testimony begins with a test. The trials you face are not meant to destroy you. They are meant to strengthen your faith and prepare you for the miracle. When God makes a way, it's not just about delivering you from your challenge. It's about revealing his glory and deepening your trust in him. In the storms of life, his promises are your anchor. Isaiah 43:19 declares, "Behold, I will do a new thing now. It shall spring forth. Shall you not know it? I will even make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." A wilderness represents desolation, and a desert represents barrenness. Yet God promises to bring life, provision, and a way forward even in those places. His word is your assurance that no situation is too far gone for him to redeem. Let us not forget the power of obedience. Sometimes the way is revealed only when we take the first step. When Joshua led the Israelites to the Jordan River, the waters did not part until the priests stepped into the river. God is calling you to take bold, obedient steps in 2025. The way may not be clear, but as you move forward in faith, God will reveal his plan one step at a time. As we stand at the edge of 2025, let us boldly declare that this is not just another year. It is a year of possibilities, breakthroughs, and divine pathways. It is the year where we will see that God will make a way. Have you ever felt like you've come to the end of the road? A place where every door seems closed, every option exhausted, and every effort futile. That's exactly where God's power shines brightest. Let me remind you of this unshakable truth: God doesn't need a path to make a way. He is the creator of the heavens and the earth, and he can carve a way where no way exists. When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea, they didn't just need a solution, they needed a miracle. And when Moses raised his staff, God didn't just give them a bridge or a boat. No, he parted the sea itself. The very thing that seemed like their obstacle became their pathway. And that is what God will do for you in 2025. Whatever seems like it's holding you back, whether it's fear, finances, relationships, or uncertainty, God is about to turn it into the very stage for your testimony. Some of you might be wondering, but what do I do when I can't see the way forward? That, my friends, is where faith steps in. Faith is not just believing that God will act it, is acting like you believe God is already working. It is walking forward in obedience even when the path ahead is foggy. Remember Abraham, who was called to leave everything familiar and journey to a land God would show him. Abraham didn't have a map or a clear plan. He only had a promise. And sometimes all you need to move forward is God's promise. Let me ask you, what promise are you holding on to in 2025? Because that promise is your compass, your anchor, and your assurance that God is making a way even now. But here's where it gets real sometimes. The way God makes doesn't look like what we expect. When we pray, we often have our own ideas about how God should answer. We want immediate solutions, open doors, and smooth paths. Yet God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts higher than our thoughts. Take Elijah, for example. In a season of drought, God provided for him through ravens, unlikely and unexpected means. And then when the brook dried up, God sent him to a widow in Zarephath. Think about that, a prophet of God being sent to a poor, desperate widow for provision. It made no sense, yet it was God's divine plan. So in 2025, be prepared for God to show up in ways that challenge your expectations but exceed your needs. And what about those times when it feels like nothing is happening? When your prayers seem to hit the ceiling and your dreams seem to stall? I want to encourage you, God is never inactive. In fact, the silence of God often signals that he's working behind the scenes, preparing something greater than you could imagine. Look at Joseph. Betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison, his story looked like a series of setbacks. But what seemed like detours were actually divine setups. Each step was orchestrated by God to position Joseph for his ultimate purpose, to save a nation during a famine. Your delay is not a denial. Your waiting season is not wasted. God is preparing the way for you. Now let me ask you this. What do you do while you wait for the way to be revealed? You stand on his promises. His word is a lamp to your feet and a light to your feet and a light to your path. It may not illuminate the entire journey, but it gives you just enough light for the next step. In Isaiah 43:19, God declares, "Behold, I am doing a new thing now, it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." A wilderness is a place of confusion and scarcity. A desert is a place of dryness and barrenness. Yet God promises to make a way and bring rivers to these very places. That means there is no circumstance too dire and no situation too hopeless and no obstacle too great for him. And let's not forget the role of obedience. When the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant to the Jordan River, the waters didn't part until their feet touched the water. That's faith in action. God didn't part the river while they stood on the banks waiting. He responded to their step of obedience. So in 2025, God is calling you to step out. Step out in faith, step out in obedience, and step out in trust. Even when it doesn't make sense, even when the resources aren't there, even when the odds are against you, take that step. Because as you move, God will move. And as you obey, he will make a way. This is not just a message, it's a declaration. God is not just the God of yesterday's miracles or tomorrow's promises. He is the God of now. In this moment, he is working. In this season, he is paving the way. In this year, he is making the impossible possible. As we press into 2025, let us remember that God's ways are not our ways, and that is good news. If God operated within our logic, he would be limited by our human understanding. But he is sovereign, eternal, and omniscient. He sees what we cannot see and knows what we cannot know. When God makes a way, it is always greater than anything we could orchestrate. Think about the feeding of the 5,000. The disciples saw a crowd and a problem. They saw 5 loaves and 2 fish and said, it's not enough, but Jesus saw a different reality. He took what seemed insufficient and turned it into abundance. What you see as not enough in 2025, whether it's resources, time, or opportunities, God sees as more than enough when placed in his hands. This is the God we serve, a God who multiplies the little we have, a God who uses the unlikely and overlooked, a God who makes a way where human effort falls short. But there is something about God's ways that we must understand. His ways often require surrender. Sometimes the biggest barrier to seeing the way God is making is our own desire to control the process. We want to see the full map before we take a step. We want guarantees before we let go. But trust in God means releasing the need to know every detail. It means saying, Lord, I don't know how, but I trust you will. Let's not forget the story of Gideon. When God called him to lead an army against the Midianites, Gideon started with 32,000 men, but God reduced that number to just 300. Why? Because God wanted Gideon to know that victory didn't come through numbers or strength, it came through his power. In 2025, God may strip away the things you've relied on so that you can see his hand at work more clearly. Don't resist the pruning because it's part of the process. And then there's the story of Lazarus, a man who was not just sick but dead for 4 days. His situation didn't just seem hopeless, it seemed final. But when Jesus arrived, he spoke life into what everyone else had written off. This year, there may be situations in your life that feel dead: dreams, relationships, opportunities. But when Jesus speaks, even the dead must rise. Let me speak directly to your heart. You may feel overwhelmed by the uncertainties of this year. The world may look chaotic, unstable, and unpredictable. But remember this: God is not moved by what moves you. He is not intimidated by the headlines, the economy, or the challenges we face. He is the same God who calmed the storm, healed the sick, and raised the dead. And he is the same God who will make a way for you. In 2025, I want you to anchor yourself in the truth of who God is. He is Jehovah Jireh, your provider. He is Jehovah Shalom, your peace. He is Jehovah Nisei, your banner of victory. His names are not just titles, they are promises. When you call on him, you are calling on the fullness of his power and faithfulness. And as you walk through this year, I challenge you to look for his fingerprints in every situation. Sometimes the way God makes isn't a grand, dramatic moment. Sometimes it's in the small, quiet victories, the unexpected kindness, the door that opens just in time, the strength you didn't know you had. These are the breadcrumbs that remind you he is near, working all things together for your good. But let me also issue a call to action. God making a way doesn't mean we sit back passively. It means we partner with him in faith and action. When Nehemiah set out to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, he prayed, but he also picked up a hammer. When Peter stepped out of the boat, he kept his eyes on Jesus and took steps on the water. Faith is not just belief, it's movement. So in 2025, ask yourself, what is God calling me to do? What steps of faith is he asking me to take? Where is he inviting me to trust him more deeply? Because as you move, he will move. As you trust, he will provide. And as you surrender, he will make a way. God is a way maker, not a way finder. Let me declare this truth with boldness. God is not a way finder, he is a way maker. He is not confined to the maps and pathways of this world. He doesn't look for existing solutions because he doesn't need them. His power is not bound by human logic, and his creativity knows no bounds. Where we see impossibility, God sees an opportunity to showcase his glory. When we think of a wayfinder, we think of someone navigating a pre-existing path. A wayfinder must rely on maps, tools, or landmarks to figure out their direction. But God operates on a completely wayfinder different level. He is not limited to what exists because he is the creator of all things. He doesn't need a bridge to cross a river. He can part the waters. He doesn't need food to come from the usual sources. He can send manna from heaven or multiply 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed thousands. Let us remember the words of Isaiah 55:8-9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts dot. This is the essence of a waymaker. God doesn't work within the limitations of human understanding. He works according to his divine wisdom and power, which surpasses all comprehension. And this truth is not just for biblical times, it is for today. It is for 2025. Think about the Red Sea moment again. The Israelites found themselves trapped. Pharaoh's army was behind them, and the vast sea was before them. To any human observer, there was no way out. But God didn't search for a hidden trail or a secret escape route. He created a path where there was none. He told Moses to lift his staff, and with a mighty wind, he parted the sea, turning an obstacle into a miracle. This is the God we serve, a God who doesn't need pre-existing solutions because he is the solution. And what he did for the Israelites, he will do for you. Let me bring this closer to home. How many times have you faced situations in life where there seemed to be no way forward? Perhaps it was a financial crisis, a broken relationship, or a health scare. You looked around and saw no options, no resources, no hope. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, a door opened. The provision came. The healing arrived. That wasn't luck, chance, or coincidence. That was God, the Waymaker, stepping into your situation. But here's the key. God's ability to make a way isn't just about delivering us from challenges. It's about deepening our trust in him. He makes a way not only to meet our needs, but also to show us his faithfulness, his power, and his love. Each time he makes a way, it's an invitation to know him more intimately and to trust him more fully. In 2025, you may find yourself in situations where the way forward isn't clear. You may face obstacles that feel insurmountable. But I want to remind you, God is already ahead of you, preparing the path. He doesn't need a solution to be in place before he acts. He is the solution. Trust him to make a way, not because the situation demands it, but because that's who he is. And let us not forget that when God makes a way, it is often far beyond what we could have imagined. Ephesians 3:20 reminds us that he is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. So when you pray in 2025, don't just pray for God to help you navigate the challenges. Pray for him to create a path that exceeds your expectations. We serve a God who doesn't search for solutions. He speaks them into existence. When he said, "Let there be light," there was light. When he said, "Peace, be still," the storm calmed. When he said, "Lazarus, come forth," the dead man walked out of the tomb. This is the God who will make a way for you, no matter what you face this year. The power of faith in unseen paths. Let us pause for a moment and reflect on one of the most powerful forces given to us. Faith is not just a belief system or an abstract concept. It is a dynamic, living connection between us and God. Faith is the bridge between what we see and what God has planned. It is the spiritual lens that allows us to trust in the unseen, to walk forward when the path ahead is hidden, and to believe in his promises, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. Hebrews 11:1 puts it so beautifully. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith takes the invisible promises of God and makes them tangible in our lives. It gives us the courage to step out, the strength to endure, and the hope to keep going, even when we cannot see how everything will unfold. But let's be real, faith is not always easy. It requires us to relinquish control, to surrender the need to know every detail, and to trust that God's plans are higher than our own. And isn't that the hardest part? We are conditioned to rely on what we can see, touch, and understand. But the life of faith calls us to move beyond the visible, to step into the unknown, and to rest in the certainty of who God is. Consider Abraham, the father of faith. God called him to leave his homeland, his family, and everything familiar, to journey to a place God would show him. Abraham didn't have a map. He didn't have GPS coordinates. All he had was a promise from God, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, Genesis 12:2. Abraham's faith wasn't rooted in what he could see, it was rooted in the character of the God who called him. And because he trusted, he stepped out into the unknown. That is the power of faith. It enables us to move forward, even when the way is hidden, because we trust the one who is leading us. Let's bring this closer to our own lives. How many times have you found yourself at a crossroads, unsure of which way to go? Maybe you're standing in the middle of a season where the answers aren't clear, the road ahead seems dark, and fear whispers, stay where you are, it's safer here. But let me tell you, this faith is what enables you to take that first step, even when you can't see the second dot. Faith doesn't wait for clarity. Faith doesn't wait for everything to make sense. Faith says, God, I don't know how, but I trust that you do. It's like walking through a dense fog where you can only see a few feet ahead. Each step you take reveals just enough for the next. That's how faith works. It unfolds the path as we move forward in trust. Think about Peter stepping out of the boat. The storm was raging, the waves were high, and logic told him it was impossible to walk on water. But when Jesus said, come, Peter didn't hesitate. He stepped out in faith. For a moment, as long as his eyes were fixed on Jesus, he walked on what should have drowned him. That's the power of faith in unseen paths. It allows you to defy what is humanly possible because your trust is in the one who makes all things possible. But notice something. Peter began to sink the moment he shifted his focus from Jesus to the waves. And isn't that what happens to us? When we focus on the uncertainty, the obstacles, or the impossibility of the situation, fear takes over and we begin to sink. In 2025, let me encourage you to keep your eyes on Jesus. Don't be distracted by the storm around you. Don't be paralyzed by what you cannot see. Instead, focus on the one who holds your future in his hands. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who does that. Faith also calls us to act, even when the outcome is uncertain. When the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant approached the Jordan River, the waters didn't part immediately. They had to step into the river first. It was only after they took that step of faith that God revealed the dry path through the waters. Faith often requires action before we see the result. And here's something profound about faith: it grows in the unseen. It is in the waiting, the uncertainty, and the trials that our faith is tested and refined. James 1:3-4 reminds us, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. That the very moments that challenge your faith are the ones that strengthen it. So as we journey through 2025, let us remember that faith is not passive. It is active, alive, and powerful. It is the hand that reaches out to God when the way is unclear. It is the voice that declares, I trust you, Lord, even in the darkest nights. And it is the anchor that holds us steady when the winds of doubt try to shake us. His provision in unlikely places. Let me remind you of this undeniable truth about our God. His provision often comes from the most unlikely places. When we think of provision, we often look to the familiar, the steady paycheck, the usual sources of support, the resources we've relied on in the past. But God is not limited to what is predictable. He specializes in providing for his children in ways that defy logic, in places that seem barren, and through means that no one could have imagined. Look at the Israelites in the wilderness. For 40 years, they wandered in a desolate land where no crops grew and no markets existed. Yet every single day, God rained down manna from heaven, bread they had never seen before, sustenance they could not have anticipated. When they were thirsty, God didn't lead them to a river or a well. Instead, he caused water to flow from a rock, a source as unlikely as it was miraculous. What do these stories teach us? They show us that God's provision is not dependent on circumstances. His resources are not limited by human scarcity. Where we see lack, he sees opportunity. Where we see barrenness, he sees the potential for abundance. But here's something even more profound. God's provision in unlikely places is designed to build our trust in Him. If He only provided in ways we could predict, we might start trusting in the method instead of the provider. By bringing provision from unexpected sources, He shifts our focus back to Him, reminding us that He is our ultimate source of everything we need. Think about Elijah during the drought. God sent him to a brook for water and commanded ravens to bring him food. Ravens, these are scavenger birds, not known for their generosity. Yet they became instruments of God's provision. And when the brook dried up, God sent Elijah to a widow in Zarephath, a woman who was down to her last handful of flour and a little oil. In human terms, she had nothing to give. But God multiplied her resources, providing not just for Elijah, but for her household as well. In both cases, the provision came from places and sources that no one would have expected. This is how God operates. He uses the unlikely to remind us that His power is not confined to human reasoning. Let's bring this into the context of our lives in 2025. Maybe you're facing a season of uncertainty, wondering how your needs will be met. Perhaps you've lost a job, or your business is struggling, or the usual sources of support have dried up. Let me encourage you with this: God's provision is not limited to what you can see. He might use a connection you never considered, open a door you didn't even know existed, or bring opportunities from places you had written off. He may even use the very thing you thought was a setback to propel you forward. Remember, the same God who sent manna from heaven can send provision to you in ways that will leave you in awe. But here's the key: we must be open to His methods. Sometimes God's provision doesn't look the way we expect it to. The Israelites had never seen manna before, and their first reaction was to ask, what is it? Exodus 16:15. Likewise, Elijah might have questioned why God would send him to a widow with almost nothing to her name. But in both cases, they trusted God's word and received His provision. So often we miss God's blessings because we're looking for them to come in a specific way. But faith requires us to be open to the unexpected. It requires us to say, Lord, I trust You to provide, even if I don't understand how. Let us also remember that God's provision is not just about meeting physical needs, it's about demonstrating His faithfulness. When He provides in unlikely places, it's not just to sustain us, but to deepen our relationship with Him. Each act of provision is a reminder that He sees us, cares for us, and is intimately involved in every detail of our lives. Think about how Jesus fed the 5,000. The disciples looked at the crowd and saw an overwhelming need. All they had were 5 loaves and 2 fish, an amount so small it seemed laughable. But Jesus didn't see lack. He saw the potential for a miracle. He took what was available, blessed it, and multiplied it to meet the need. And not only was everyone fed, but there were leftovers, 12 baskets full. This is the God we serve, the God of abundance, who takes what seems insufficient and makes it more than enough. As we step into 2025, I want to encourage you to trust God's ability to provide in ways you've never considered. Don't limit Him to what seems possible. Instead, look to Him with expectant faith, knowing that He can bring streams in the desert, manna in the wilderness, and water from a rock. Delays are not denials. There's a lesson we all need to carry into 2025. God's delays are not His denials. When we face waiting seasons in life, it's easy to assume that God isn't listening, that He's forgotten us, or worse, that He's forgotten us, or worse, that His promises won't come to pass. But let me assure you, God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't align with our own. Every delay has a purpose, and every moment of waiting is an opportunity for God to work behind the scenes for our good. Let's turn to Scripture for a moment. Remember the story of Lazarus? When Jesus received word that his dear friend was sick, He didn't rush to Bethany. Instead, He stayed where he was for 2 more days. By the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. To everyone present, it seemed like Jesus had arrived too late. But Jesus had a plan far greater than anyone could comprehend. This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. John 11:4. When Jesus called Lazarus out of the tomb, it wasn't just a healing, it was a resurrection. The delay wasn't a denial, it was an opportunity to reveal a greater glory. How often do we, like Mary and Martha, question God's timing? We cry out, Lord, if only you had acted sooner. But what we fail to realize is that God's timing is not about meeting our expectations. It's about fulfilling his divine purpose. That he is never early, never late. He is always right on time. Consider the story of Joseph. As a young man, Joseph received dreams from God that he would one day rise to a position of great influence. But before those dreams were fulfilled, he endured betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment. For years, it seemed like God's promise was delayed, even forgotten. But in reality, every setback was a setup. God was aligning circumstances, refining Joseph's character, and preparing him to step into his destiny at the exact right moment. When Joseph finally became second in command in Egypt, he was able to say to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives," Genesis 50:20. This is the beauty of God's timing. It is always working for our good, even when we can't see IT. Now, let's bring this into our own lives. Have you ever prayed for something earnestly, faithfully, and felt like the answer was delayed? Maybe you've been waiting for a breakthrough, a healing, a restoration, or an opportunity. The waiting can feel excruciating and doubt can creep in, whispering, maybe it's never going to happen, but let me remind you, God is not ignoring you. He is orchestrating something greater than you can imagine. We live in a culture of immediacy. We want things now, and when they don't happen on our timetable, we assume something is wrong. But God doesn't operate on human schedules. He sees the end from the beginning, and he knows the exact moment when his promise will have its fullest impact. Think about Sarah and Abraham. God promised them a child, but years went by without any sign of fulfillment. Sarah even tried to take matters into her own hands, offering her servant Hagar to Abraham. But human efforts cannot speed up divine timing. At the appointed time, God fulfilled his promise and Isaac was born. When God makes you wait, it's not because he's forgotten, it's because he's preparing something better than you expect. And here's something we often overlook: the waiting season is not wasted time. During the delays, God is working in ways we cannot see. He is building our faith, shaping our character, and aligning circumstances for his glory and our good. Waiting is not a punishment, it's a process. Isaiah 40:31 reminds us, "But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Waiting on God renews us. It strengthens us. It prepares us to soar when the time is right. And let's not forget that God often does his greatest work in the waiting. When the Israelites were wandering in the desert for 40 years, they might have seen it as a delay. But in that time, God was teaching them, providing for them, and preparing them to enter the promised land. The delay was not a denial, it was a season of preparation. So as you step into 2025, remember this: if you're in a waiting season, don't lose heart. Delays are not the absence of God's hand, they are the evidence of his careful planning. Trust that he is working behind the scenes, aligning every detail, and preparing you to step into his promises at just the right time. The testing of faith precedes breakthrough. I want to take a moment to delve into a profound and often challenging truth. The testing of faith precedes his breakthrough. Throughout Scripture, we see a consistent pattern. Before God unveils his miraculous power, he allows his people to face seasons of testing. It's as if God uses the fire of trials to refine and purify our faith, ensuring that we are prepared to handle the blessings and breakthroughs he is about to release. James 1:2-3 says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance." The testing of faith is not something to fear or dread, it is something to embrace. For in that testing lies the seed of perseverance, and in perseverance lies the preparation for the breakthrough. Let's look at some powerful examples in Scripture. Abraham, the father of faith, was tested when God asked him to sacrifice his promised son, Isaac. Can you imagine the turmoil Abraham must have felt? The promise of God, the hope of a future through Isaac, and now God was asking him to give up that very promise. It didn't make sense. But in his obedience, Abraham demonstrated the depth of his trust in God. And it was in the moment of greatest surrender that God revealed his provision. Just as Abraham raised the knife, God provided a ram for the sacrifice. And through that testing, a breakthrough came not only for Abraham, but for all of humanity as God reaffirmed his covenant with him. Joseph also experienced this principle of testing before breakthrough. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. But each step of his trial was a part of the process. When Joseph stood before Pharaoh and interpreted his dream, the breakthrough came not just for Joseph, but for an entire nation. God used the testing seasons to refine Joseph's character and prepare him for the weight of the responsibility he would soon carry. The delay, the betrayal, the imprisonment, none of it was wasted. All of it was God's divine preparation for the breakthrough. Peter also faced a testing of faith when he stepped out of the boat to walk on water toward Jesus. When the winds and waves began to challenge him, his faith wavered and he began to sink. But Jesus didn't condemn Peter. He reached out and pulled him up. That moment of testing strengthened Peter's faith and gave him a deeper revelation of who Jesus was. In fact, that testing was the foundation for the breakthroughs that Peter would experience later as a bold preacher and leader of the early church. We all face times of uncertainty, trial, and testing. It's part of the human experience. But the key is to remember that these moments are often the very precursors to the miracles God is preparing to unveil in our lives. When you feel like you're walking through a wilderness, when the doors seem closed and when every step forward feels like a battle, remember this. God is using that moment to prepare you for something greater. Think about David. Before he was anointed as king, he spent years in hiding, running from King Saul, facing dangers and loneliness. Yet it was in those years of struggle that David developed the faith, the resilience, and the courage he would need to lead a nation. David's breakthrough as king came after the testing of his faith. The same God who was with him in the sheepfold, protecting him from lions and bears, was the God who would empower him to defeat Goliath and lead Israel to greatness. In our own lives, times of uncertainty, financial strain, relational struggles, or health challenges can feel like periods of testing. But I want you to hear this clearly. Testing is not an indication of failure. It is evidence that God is working on something bigger than you can see. Often, the breakthroughs that God has in store for us require a level of character, strength, and maturity that only comes through testing. And let's not forget that the testing of our faith brings us closer to God. In the midst of trials, we often turn to God more intimately, seeking his guidance, strength, and comfort. The process of being tested deepens our relationship with him, and in turn, we begin to see things from his perspective. We move from being passive recipients to active participants in his kingdom work. Let's bring this into a personal context for 2025. Maybe you're in the middle of a difficult season right now. It could be a season of financial pressure, relational conflict, or an overwhelming challenge that seems to have no end in sight. I want you to remember this: the testing you're facing right now is not the end of the story. It's the setup for the breakthrough. The breakthrough doesn't come because of your ability to endure, but because of God's ability to work through your faith in the midst of the trial. What God is doing in you during the test is preparing you for what he is about to do through you in the breakthrough. He is refining your faith, fortifying your trust, and positioning you to carry the weight of the blessing that is coming. If you're in a season of testing right now, I urge you, don't give up. Don't lose heart. The testing of your faith is producing something far greater than you can imagine. It's creating perseverance, building character, and preparing you for the breakthrough that will come at just the right time. Trust that God is working behind the scenes. His timing is perfect, and his plan is unfolding according to his will. God's promises are anchors in the storm. In life, we all face storms, moments of chaos, uncertainty, and overwhelming challenges. Whether they come in the form of personal struggles, financial difficulties, health crises, or global crises that seem to shake the very foundations of our world, the storms we encounter can leave us feeling disoriented and fearful. But here is a profound truth that we must hold on to. With everything we have, God's promises are anchors in the storm dot. In the midst of turmoil, we are not left to navigate the waters of life on our own. God's word stands as a firm foundation, a sure promise that no matter how fierce the storm, he will make a way for you. His promises are not mere words. They are the very anchor that holds us steady when the waves of life threaten to overwhelm us. The storms in life have a way of distorting our vision, clouding our judgment, and making us feel as if we are drifting aimlessly. But it is in these moments that God's promises shine the brightest. His word is a light to our path, guiding us when we can't see clearly. His promises are the fixed points in the vast ocean of life, giving us direction when the winds of fear and doubt blow fiercely. Consider the story of Jesus and his disciples on the stormy sea. In Mark 4:35-41, when a furious storm arose while they were crossing the lake, the disciples feared for their lives, even though Jesus was in the boat with them. They woke him up and he calmed the storm with a simple command: quiet, be still. The storm immediately subsided and the disciples were amazed. What's powerful here is that before they ever set out on that journey, Jesus had already spoken his promise. Let us go over to the other side, Mark 4:35. Jesus didn't promise them a storm-free journey. He didn't promise calm waters and gentle winds. But he promised that they would reach the other side. That promise became their anchor in the storm. Even when the winds raged and the waves threatened to capsize the boat, the disciples should have held fast to the truth of Jesus' word. They were going to the other side. God's promises are our anchors when life feels chaotic. The storms will come. They are inevitable. But the assurance of God's promises will keep us grounded no matter how fierce the storm becomes. Take, for instance, the promise of Psalm 23:4, which assures us, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. This promise tells us that even in the darkest, most terrifying times, God is with us. With us. His presence brings comfort, direction, and peace. It is a promise that reminds us we are never alone, no matter how overwhelming the circumstances may seem. The promise of Romans 8:28 assures us that. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. This verse is a powerful anchor in times of uncertainty and trial. It reminds us that no matter how chaotic our lives may appear in the moment, God is at work behind the scenes, orchestrating everything for our good. We may not see it, and we may not understand it, but we can trust that God's plan is unfolding according to his purpose. This truth provides us with hope, direction, and a reason to keep moving forward, even when the storm rages on. Another promise that anchors us is found in Isaiah 43:2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. This promise is so powerful because it doesn't say we won't go through the storms or the flames. It says that when we go through them, God will be with us, protecting us, sustaining us, and bringing us through the other side. We will not drown in the waters. We will not be consumed by the fire. God's promises assure us that he will make a way, even in the midst of life's greatest trials. As we face the challenges of 2025, I want to encourage you, hold fast to God's promises. When you feel like you're sinking, when the winds are howling, and when the storm clouds seem to blot out all hope, remember the promise that God will make a way. His word stands firm, and he will never fail to fulfill what he has spoken. Just like the anchor that holds a ship in place amidst the stormy sea, God's promises are what keep us grounded in the storm. That we may not always understand the journey or the timing, but we can trust that God is faithful. His word is a rock on which we stand, unshaken and unmoved by the storms of life. In those moments when fear tries to grip your heart, let the promises of God remind you of his unchanging faithfulness. When the chaos of the world seeks to overwhelm you, remember that you have an anchor in the storm. God's promises are more reliable than anything this world can offer. Walking in obedience opens the way. There is a powerful truth that we must understand as we enter into 2025. Walking in obedience opens the way. When we align ourselves with God's will and take steps of obedience, it often reveals the path that He is already paving for us. Too often we wait for a clear picture of the entire journey before taking a step of faith. But in reality, obedience is the key that unlocks the doors of God's provision and guidance. Obedience may seem like a simple concept, but it is one of the most profound principles in our walk with God. It's about aligning our hearts and actions with His purposes, even when we can't see the entire picture. God's instructions are not arbitrary. They are designed to lead us to the fullness of His plan for our lives. The path we walk may not always be the one we expected, but when we walk in obedience, we find that God is already at work, creating the way before us. In Genesis 12, God called Abraham to leave his country, his people, and his father's household and go to a land that He would show him. Abraham had no clear map, no guarantee of what he would find, and no knowledge of what the future held. Yet, Abraham's obedience set in motion the fulfillment of God's promise to make him the father of many nations. Abraham didn't need to understand the destination fully. All he needed to do was obey. And in his obedience, God revealed the path step by step. Think about Moses. When God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses was hesitant and full of doubt. He questioned God's choice of him and hesitated to take that first step of obedience. Yet, once Moses obeyed God's command to confront Pharaoh, a series of divine events unfolded: plagues, miracles, and eventually the miraculous parting of the Red Sea. But none of this happened until Moses took that first step of obedience. When Moses obeyed God, the way was made clear. Let's also consider the example of Noah. God instructed him to build an ark in preparation for a flood, even though there had never been a flood before. Noah faced ridicule, doubt, and disbelief from those around him. Yet Noah's obedience to God's word set the stage for the salvation of his family and the future of humanity. The ark became the vessel through which Noah and his family were delivered, but it was obedience to God's command that opened the way for that deliverance. In our own lives, there are times when God will ask us to step out in obedience, even when the road ahead seems unclear. He may ask us to forgive when it's hard, to give when we don't have much, or to move when we don't know where we're going. But every step of obedience, no matter how small it may seem, opens the way for His will to be accomplished in and through our lives. Walking in obedience reveals the path God is already paving. It's as though God has already prepared the way for us, but we must step forward in obedience for the way to be revealed. Think about Joshua and the Israelites as they prepared to cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. God instructed them to step into the river, even though the waters were at flood stage. The moment they stepped in, the waters parted, revealing the dry land they were to cross. The path was already there, but it required their obedience to reveal it. In 2025, God may be calling you to take bold steps of obedience. You may not have all the answers. You may not know how things will unfold. But I encourage you to take that step. Trust that God has already prepared the way, and as you walk in obedience, He will reveal the next step, the next door, the next opportunity. Obedience isn't about knowing the outcome. It's about trusting that God's plan is greater than our understanding. Let's also remember that obedience is often linked to timing. In the story of Elijah and the widow at Zarephath, God instructed the widow to use the last of her flour and oil to make a meal for the prophet Elijah. The widow was facing famine, yet in obedience, she trusted God's provision. Her act of obedience unlocked the miraculous supply that continued for months. God often calls us to step out in faith, not knowing what will happen next, but trusting that He will provide along the way. In 2025, God is inviting us to a life of radical obedience. He's asking us to trust Him, to follow His promptings, and to step into the unknown with confidence that He will guide our steps. Every time we choose obedience over fear or doubt, we open the door for God to reveal His provision, His power, and His purpose in our lives. Obedience opens the way. As we walk in alignment with God's will, the path will become clearer. The next step will appear, and the doors we thought were closed will swing wide open. It's in the act of obedience that God's miracles are released. When we say yes to God, we are stepping into His perfect plan, and the way He has already prepared for us will unfold before our eyes. A conclusion. As we close today, let us take a moment to reflect on the powerful truths we've explored together. God will make a way in 2025, not because of our own strength, but because of His unwavering promise and His ability to move mountains on our behalf. We've seen that God is not merely a way finder, He is the ultimate way maker, creating paths where none exist. His provision is not bound by our limitations, and when we trust in His unseen paths, He will guide us through even when we cannot yet see the end. We've learned that delays are not denials. God's timing is perfect, and the testing of our faith often precedes the breakthroughs He is preparing for us. Remember, in those moments of uncertainty when the way seems blocked, that is often the very moment God is preparing you for something greater. The challenges we face today are laying the groundwork for the miracles of tomorrow. And as we walk through life's storms, let us hold tightly to God's promises, which are the anchors in our most turbulent moments. When life feels chaotic and the path ahead is unclear, His word remains a steady foundation, giving us hope and direction. His promises do not fail, and they will carry us through every season of life. Finally, we've seen that obedience opens the way. God is calling each one of us to take that first step, to walk in alignment with His will, even when the path seems uncertain. When we choose obedience over fear, we unlock the doors to divine provision, protection, and purpose. It's not always easy, but God's faithfulness is always certain. In 2025, I encourage you to embrace your role as vessels of purpose. Understand that you are not just walking through life aimlessly. You are walking with purpose, and God is shaping every step you take to fulfill His divine plan. Trust that His ways are higher than our own, that He is orchestrating the perfect plan for your life, and that every moment of obedience, no matter how small, brings you closer to the fulfillment of that purpose. So as you stand at the crossroads of this new year, remember, God will make a way. Trust in His promises, hold firm to your faith, and know that the path ahead is already paved. Your steps of obedience will open doors, and in the midst of any storm, He will be with you every step of the way. Step into this year with boldness, knowing that the God who makes a way is with you, and He is working behind the scenes for your good. You are part of a greater plan. You are part of His purpose, and He will make a way for you in 2025.